You know, when you sit up and you have too much time on your hands, sometimes you think some of the most ridiculous things, and other times you mess around and think something that's thought-provoking. Now, you know, the society that we're in is now in the middle of an identity politics war. And, you know about identity politics, Black Lives Matter, racially motivated killings allegedly by police officers. There's just so much stuff happening. And violence in larger, predominantly black communities, cities. Now, whenever I hear stories like this, there are people that normally support ideas such as a lot of the inability by African Americans in the United States to advance is because of the effects of 400 years of slavery. And it's kind of become, and not everybody's saying it. There's a sudden shift, and there is a contingency of blacks in America that are now choosing to explore other possibilities as to finding a remedy for the plight of black people in America. But the number is still too few. The numbers that subscribe to the 400 years of slavery mindset are pretty much a majority. Now, when there is black underachievement, when there is inequality as far as pay, when there are situations where black on black violence is at an astronomical level, I sometimes hear the excuse, 400 years of slavery. It can be used nearly for anything. And it used to be a legitimate reason. But, looking back at that brief period of time right after slavery, I think it was during Reconstruction, and Thomas Sowell had touched upon it. African Americans were doing extremely well, and many Northern African Americans were doing better than Southern Americans. And this is during a time where there was systemic racism, and systemic racism is racism that's on the books. I think people get systemic and subversive racism mixed up together. I don't know why they do. Wikipedia is sitting right there for you to look at. Now, the conversation about 400 years of slavery is not a unique conversation by any stretch of the imagination. But a conversation that hasn't been had, I think, makes for a unique topic. If by the same token African Americans are affected by 400 years of slavery, what if, and I don't subscribe to it necessarily, but it was a random thought, what if whites are affected by, the Western civilization's been around forever, and different forms of slavery have been around forever in the African community and in the European countries as well. It's not a unique thing. But what if white Americans were affected by 400 years of a slaveholder mentality? Now, I know that that's stupid because, maybe, 3%, 4% of the population actually owned slaves. Owning slaves was a very expensive endeavor. But what if the mindset, however, had been adopted by a majority of Americans during that period of time? I mean, we have to look at certain laws. I mean, you had the 3/5 of a man law. Basically, when you bought a slave, you were buying something that was less than human. And I assume that there were Americans that wanted to buy their 3/5 of a human to work on their, in their homes, on their land, but couldn't afford them. But I don't think, if this is, this idea could be true, then it stands to reason that that we might need to start looking at things from a different perspective. How do you wean somebody who may have, not definitely, remember this is just one of those, this is a conversation over a random thought I had while being possessed of extreme boredom. What if they were having difficulty dealing with the thought of equality for something that was once viewed as 3/5 of a human being? Would they get a pass for their actions? They're trying to cope with, well, I'm trying to get over the fact that, once upon a time I didn't even view you as a human being. And I'm having a little difficulty dealing with that. Now, keep in mind I'm being facetious with this conversation because I am headed in a direction, okay? I'm not being a white sympathizer. I'm not being a black sympathizer. But what I'm doing is I'm illustrating how society can be very selective when talking about a difficult subject. There are people that have said, well, slavery wasn't that bad. And, that's white guilt, the minimizing the blow of their particular brand of evil. And then there's African Americans that say, well, you have to understand our shortcomings. Our lack of performance in American society is because of something else. Nobody wants to take responsibility for anything. I know the majority of white Americans don't think, today that African Americans are 3/5 of human beings. But there are African Americans that revel in the idea of being owed. And they can't even see that payment has come in different ways. Just not necessarily directly to their pockets in a set dollar amount. An African American man, half African American man, won the presidency. Blacks are more visible now than they ever have been. And they're 12% of the population. They are nearly neck and neck for visibility on TV and representations in film than their white majority. What does equality really look like? You know what I think? I think everybody has their own brand of equal. And that goes from the white supremacists to the black supremacists to the feminists. I think they all have their brand, and they use the word equality. Let's be real. There's nothing equal about 12% of the population being as visible in the media as, what is it, the 60, 70, well, 60, I think it's 60. Don't quote me on my numbers. The 60% white majority. There's no, that's not equal. True equality means you're represented based off of the numbers of people that there are. I mean, if you want to get down to the driest idea. Now, granted, I love seeing other kinds of people on TV. But that's a falsity. That doesn't represent what America really looks like. That's a false narrative. We are really enraptured in false narratives in every aspects of public, social, our society. So getting back to the original idea, if whites were affected by the slave owner, even though, like I said, 4% of the population had slaves, but if they were, overcome by slave owner fever, the want and the desire to have slaves, and the acknowledgement that blacks were 3/5 of a person. I would have to say, as far as and I think other people would say, Thomas Sowell said, it's not that blacks are doing so horribly, it's just that African Americans started further back. Or perhaps whites aren't doing so poorly in their area of racial acceptance. It's just that we have to remember that they were affected too by slavery. And I say that facetiously, as the slave owners. A lot of progress has been made, but for whatever reason, we won't stop and smell the flowers or sniff the roses. It's always on to the next comparison of how my situation is more important than your situation. Do you understand how ludicrous the conversation seems when we're talking about 400 years of slavery versus 400 years of slave ownery? It sounds ridiculous. And the argument could be made, well, 4% of the population versus 100% of the population being enslaved. But 100% of the population was there at the time. They were there at the time. And just because the rest of the population didn't own slaves, that doesn't mean that they were not exposed to a racist society. And you see that years later, after the slaves were quote unquote freed, you see those pictures of people in the 50s and 60s, of the lynchings, the blacks hung from trees, and you see the empty look in those Americans' eyes, those white Americans' eyes, very empty, very day-to-day look. They look as though it's the same look that they would have if they were waiting on barbecue to get done. That was systemic at the time. That was a norm. It was okay to hate in that manner. And now these same white people are putting black people into office. These same white people are producing $100 million grossing films in which the main character is black. These same white people are making commercials so that interracial dating is fine. African Americans are extraordinarily visible. So can we really make the excuse? And because here's the deal. All of us walking around today are descendants from those people, but we're not those people. The same people who, black and white, who courageously take a chance and vote on a black president and actually hear policy are descended from the same people, possibly, that sat there at the black hanging and burning, the black man barbecue with those empty eyes. These same African Americans that are rising in society are the same African Americans descended from those slaves. Those kinds of human beings have formed their own identity. And I think society might want to take a page from those African Americans and white Americans that are forging their own way and not being trapped in a perpetual state of slavery, slave ownery. It's a new time, and all we have to remember is that it's a new time, it's a new age. And we have to start forging our own history as human beings. I don't think we take into consideration enough the good that one another does in real time, in current time. I think we're so trapped in atrocity mode that we're unable to see progress. It's just a thought. In a society based off of the now, where people are people, it's a dream I have. I think about that a lot. It's time for a morning cup of coffee. Take care.